Today's lesson is on solving simple equations. First, we're going to solve equations using addition. So we're going to solve the equation. So for number 1, we have x minus 7 equals negative 6. In this problem, we are subtracting 7 from x. In order to solve, we need to do the opposite, or the inverse operation. The opposite of subtracting 7 would be to add 7. So we will add 7 to both sides. If we have minus 7 plus 7, which would be something as saying negative 7 plus 7, that would be 0. So on the left-hand side, I'm just left with x. And now on the right-hand side, we have negative 6 plus 7, and negative 6 plus 7 is 1. Now for number 2, we have g minus 1 7/10 equals negative 9/10. We are subtracting 1 7/10 from g, so we're going to do the opposite, or the inverse operation, which would be to add 1 7/10. We'll do that on both sides. That way our equation remains balanced. If we're subtracting 1 7/10 and then we add 1 7/10, that would be 0, so we're just left with g on the left-hand side. And then on the right-hand side, I have negative 9/10 plus 1 7/10. Since we have a negative and a positive, we're going to subtract them. 1 7/10 minus 9/10 would be 8/10. And then we look at the absolute values of the numbers. Absolute value of negative 9/10 is 9/10. Absolute value of 1 7/10 is 1 7/10. And 1 7/10 is bigger when we look at our absolute value. And that number is positive, so our answer is also positive. So g equals 8/10. Now we're going to solve equations using subtraction. So for number 3, we have b plus 2 equals negative 5. In our problem, we're adding 2. So we're going to do the opposite, or the inverse operation, which would be to subtract 2. We'll subtract 2 on the left and on the right. On the left-hand side, plus 2 minus 2 is 0, so we just have b. And on the right-hand side, we have negative 5 minus 2. So if we have negative 5 minus 2, we want to add the opposite, so we're going to add a negative 2. So negative 5 plus negative 2 is negative 7. For number 4, we have y plus 3 4/10 equals 5/10. In our problem, we are adding 3 4/10 to y, so we need to do the opposite, or the inverse operation. So the opposite would be to subtract 3 4/10. We will do the same thing to both sides. And now we're going to go ahead, and on the left-hand side, we just have y, because if we have 3 4/10 minus 3 4/10, that's 0. And on the right-hand side, we have 5/10 minus 3 4/10. And if we're subtracting, we're going to add the opposite. So we have 5/10 plus negative 3 4/10. Since we have a negative and a positive, we're going to subtract our numbers. So 3 4/10 minus 5/10. And when we subtract, we're going to get 2 9/10. Now we need to see if it's positive or negative. The absolute value of 5/10 is 5/10, and the absolute value of negative 3 4/10 is 3 4/10. The absolute value of negative 3 4/10 is larger than the absolute value of 5/10. 3 4/10 is negative in the problem, so our answer is going to also be negative. So y equals negative 2 9/10. Now we're going to solve equations using multiplication. So for number 5, we have y divided by 4 equals negative 7. So in this problem, we are dividing by 4. The opposite of dividing by 4, the inverse operation, would be to multiply by 4. So we're going to multiply both sides by 4. When we multiply the left-hand side by 4, that's the same thing as saying 4 over 1. And our 4's will then end up canceling out because we can simplify those to both 1. So we just have y on the left-hand side And negative 7 times 4 is negative 28. So y equals negative 28. For number 6, we have negative 3/4 times n equals negative 2. We are multiplying the left-hand side by negative 3/4. So in order to solve, we can multiply by the reciprocal. So we can go ahead and multiply by negative 4/3. So we're going to multiply both sides by negative 4/3. You'll see that when we do this, when we simplify this fraction, 4 and 4 can both be divided by 4, so those become 1s. And 3 and 3 can both be divided by 3, so those also become 1s. A negative times a negative is a positive, which just leaves me now with n on the left-hand side. And now we're going to multiply the right-hand side. Negative 2 is the same thing as negative 2 over 1. Notice that we have a negative times a negative, so our answer is going to be positive. So now we're going to multiply 2 times 4, which is 8. And 1 times 3 is 3. We already determined this was going to be a positive answer because a negative times a negative is positive. So our answer is n equals 8/3, which we could also simplify that and say that n equals 2 and 2/3. Now we're going to solve equations using division. For number 7, we have 9/100 times w equals 1 8/10. You'll see that we are multiplying 9/100 times w, so the opposite, or the inverse, would be to divide. So we can divide by 9/100 on both sides. 9/100 divided by 9/100 would just be 1, so it leaves us with just w. And now we need to divide 1 8/10 by 9/100. When we divide, we're going to move our decimal to the right 2 places, 1, 2, to make that a whole number. So now we're also going to move it for 1 8/10. We move it over 2 places to the right as well. So now this becomes 180 divided by 9. 9 goes into 18 2 times. 2 times 9 is 18. We'll bring down our 0. And 9 goes into 0 0 times, which is 0. We subtract, and we're left with nothing. So we're left with 0. So our answer is 20. So w equals 20. And for number 8, we have 6 pi equals pi times x. We are multiplying pi times x. Since we're multiplying pi times x, we're going to divide by pi to solve for x. So we're dividing by pi on both sides. Pi divided by pi would just be 1, so it leaves us with just x on the right-hand side. And on the left-hand side, 6 pi divided by pi would just be 6, because pi divided by pi is 1. So x equals 6, which we can also write as x equals 6, or we have 6 equals x. Both would be correct.